Hello, my name is Danielle Theodore, and this is my reflection of learning. In today's presentation, I am going to unpack a few key topics. First and foremost, I'm going to define a community of learners. Second, I'm going to reflect on my aspects of my classroom and my teaching practices. I'm going to describe the ways that my classroom environment promotes student risk-taking and achievement. I am then going to talk about my current teaching practices and reflect on what I would like to change or adapt. Next, I'm going to discuss how I can better serve diverse students with diverse needs. Then I am going to design a professional development session and unpack that a little bit. And finally, I will be sharing my final takeaways with colleagues. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. What is a community of learners? A community of learners begins with a classroom in which students feel valued and supported. In this type of classroom, students of all ages and of diverse backgrounds feel seen, they feel heard, and they feel guided by their teacher. When students begin to feel cared for by their teacher, the classroom climate shifts. It becomes a safe place for learning to occur and where students feel comfortable enough to take academic risks. In this kind of nurturing classroom, students work cooperatively and then they can work productively together with their peers. At the individual level, students feel motivated and they strive to do quality work. Students are given the freedom to explore and interpret the curriculum and learning content independently, rather than relying on a more traditional teacher-centered approach. A community of learners is based on learner-centered principles, and teachers need to be aware that students construct knowledge from their understandings, the skill sets that they have, their attitudes, their beliefs, and their experiences, and the cultural diversity that they bring to the learning environment. Teachers can support learning in a learner-centered classroom by applying the principles and providing appropriate feedback to each student or student group. All right, so what aspects of my current approach to teaching do I consider learner-centered? And does my classroom promote learner-centeredness and promote risk-taking? A learner-centered classroom is a place where students are the center of the learning process. Through this approach, students feel empowered to take ownership of their education and their learning and are encouraged to reflect on what they are learning and how they are learning it. In my classroom, I cultivate an environment where students feel loved, they feel supported, and therefore engaged in the learning process. Active student engagement is a critical component for effective learning and in the development of language acquisition. When I give my students the opportunity to choose what they study by giving them options and allow them to pick the topics relevant to their lives or their interests or their needs, students become more engaged and they become more motivated in their learning. The research shows that when students are given control of what they learn and how they learn, they often find the learning process more meaningful, more enjoyable, and they're more motivated to learn. Brennan defines motivation as the effort an individual is willing to take towards achieving their goals. When students are more motivated to learn, they are more likely to use strategies that require more effort, enabling them to process new information more deeply. I create a positive learning environment for my second grade students by making learning student-centered and giving students control of their learning and education. In a learner-centered classroom, I recognize the cultural context of learning and allow my students to decide what they learn and how they learn. I support their learning by guiding the learning process, implementing learner-centered principles, and providing feedback to each student or student group. In any of my English language arts, science, and social studies lessons, students are able to explore topics of their choice. They work together to solve problems, ask questions, and they are actively engaged in open discussions. These key ideas contribute to an overall sense of belonging where my students feel valued as individuals and they feel equipped to take on challenges. I also incorporate motivational strategies by setting realistic performance goals. To help my students reach their goals, I build on prior knowledge and slowly build proficiency and confidence. All right, so let's move on to adapting my teaching practices. After completing this course, there's many different things that I would like to change. I would like to apply more learner-centered principles to all of my lessons, including math. The research shows that a learner-centered classroom promotes student engagement, collaborative learning, and allows for students to solve problems and to think critically. While I offer opportunities for students to reflect on the learning goals, I would like to give them more freedom in setting and monitoring their own learning objectives. Right now, there is no system in place that allows my students to monitor their own progress or to review it. Rather than relying solely on formal assessments and my teacher feedback, I would like students to be able to self-reflect and set goals for themselves that will help them become more intrinsically motivated to succeed. Integrating the curriculum into my learner-centered classroom will help improve my students' outcomes and organize the content standards so that students can learn complex ideas and even apply them in their own lives and in the real world. All right, so how can I serve my diverse students? By using the learner-centered approach. My goal as a second grade teacher is to create an environment in which all of my students are acknowledged and a place where my students feel comfortable sharing their perspectives, their ideas, and their beliefs. In my classroom, I believe my students feel safe because their perspectives are heard and respected. A learner-centered approach helps serve my diverse students because it facilitates the building of intercultural skills through participation and collaboration with their peers. I also adapt my teaching styles to fit my students' diverse needs, and I modify my instruction based on what worked and what didn't, and what my students need. Being reflective in my teaching practices and analyzing what worked and what didn't, I'm better able to design instruction that is flexible and can change based on my diverse student needs. I could design a learner-centered professional development session, and these are the steps that I would take in order to complete this. Designing a learner-centered professional development session would require that the lesson to be learner-centered. In my professional development, participants or colleagues would first brainstorm learner-centered principles and approaches that they can help personalize the learning experience for student learners of all ages. Then, colleagues would then discuss their ideas with the group and share examples of how these principles are evident in their current teaching practices. As the facilitator myself, I would then introduce learner-centered concepts and research-backed practices related to cooperative and collaborative learning, as well as problem-based tasks. Colleagues would then be given the option of working in a collaborative group setting to design an integrated learner-centered lesson. It would also be interesting to put colleagues who teach different disciplines together to see what they come up with. Colleagues can work collaboratively and even use a problem-based approach if they'd like. After giving groups time to construct their lesson plan, I would allow colleagues to share their ideas and approaches and create a shared document where all colleagues can assess and access the lesson plans for future use. All right, my final takeaways. What aspects of a community of learners and a learner-centered classroom would I share with my colleagues? I would first emphasize the advantages of a learner-centered classroom. I would share the advantages of a learner-centered practices and how this promotes student engagement and achievement. I would also share the research and how it suggests that students are more engaged in the learning in a learner-centered classroom, and how they develop critical thinking skills. In a learner-centered classroom, students achieve higher academic outcomes than classrooms that do not. Students feel that the curriculum is more meaningful when they take ownership of their learning in a learner-centered classroom. In a learner-centered classroom, I, as a teacher, can differentiate, making the curriculum more accessible to diverse learners and helping students acquire the knowledge that makes it more meaningful to them. A learner-centered classroom promotes student engagement, it promotes collaborative learning, and allows for students to work collaboratively to solve real-life problems and to think critically. A learner-centered classroom will help my diverse students improve their learning outcomes and allow them to learn complex ideas and apply them in their school-aged years and in their futures.